Welcome to A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions' latest episode of The Wave of the Future. The Wave of the Future will keep you in the know about the forces that are shaping the world of business, collaboration, globalization, and sustainability. We'll talk about how these forces are changing the marketplace and the innovative solutions that A.T. Kearney is bringing to our clients. We'll bring you real-life stories of how we are working with our clients and practical solutions to meeting the challenges of an increasingly virtual, decentralized, and resource-constrained world. Sharing knowledge is powerful. From London, I'm Helen Clegg, and I'm here today with my guest Claude Fidelin in New York to talk about the role of culture in negotiations. Claude is a senior manager in the Procurement and Analytics team within A.T. Kearney. He's a French national of Caribbean descent, educated in the UK and now living in the US. Over the past 10 years, Claude has worked throughout Europe, the Middle East and North America, so has a lot of experience working in different cultures. Claude started studying cultural differences over 12 years ago at Vaxio University in Sweden and developed a training methodology on the cultural aspects of negotiation. Claude has trained and coached more than 400 people, from automotive accessories buyers to executive MBA students in New York City and London. Claude, welcome again to the series. I'd like to start by asking you about culture and the importance of culture. So we live in a global, connected world these days. When it comes to culture, why is it important? And in the context of doing business, especially negotiating with people.
Hi, Helen. It's a pleasure to be with you here with you as well. So, Helen, before I start talking about culture, I just would like to talk about an important disclaimer. There are no better or worse culture. Cultures are just different, and you need to understand it and approach it that way. But there, again, I repeat, there are no better or worse cultures. Having said that, I think the reason why approaching and talking and understanding cultural differences is important is because people still don't fully understand the impact it can have on your negotiation or even more broadly, your interaction on a day-to-day basis. And for this, I would like to take the example the quote from Gerd Hofstede, who said that cultural differences are a nuisance at best and very often a disaster. So let's think about it. Let's reflect. In negotiation, what we want is to create a common understanding. Only when you have a common understanding, you can really find some integrative ways to come to the right conclusion. And when you consider cultural differences and this gap that it typically creates between people, it just makes it very challenging to come to this common understanding and therefore find some win-win solutions that would be beneficial to both parties. One example that we take in the training is actually a question. And I asked the participants what would they do if they were in the Middle East dealing with a Middle East supplier and one of the shipments was very late. Would they threaten the supplier or would they call in for personal favor? And it's not so often that people realize that in the Middle East with the culture, it's much more effective to call in for personal favor rather than threatening or placing an ultimatum on the supplier.
Gosh, that's really interesting, Claude. Very, very interesting to hear that example. Claude, I'd like to move on and bring in the procurement angle here. How do negotiations differ when you're dealing with suppliers from different countries? Can you share some insight around that with the audience?
I think we always emphasize on how important is preparation in negotiation. When there's like cultural differences that come into the mix for the negotiation, it's the same. A lot of it is about preparation. You need to put extra care on that aspect. And maybe the most obvious example would be around the negotiating team structure. Who do you invite around the table from your team, but also from your counterpart team? Do you invite legal? Do you invite an agent? Do you have the executive for the full length of the negotiation? Or do you also have people from the technical and design? And what people need to realize is in some cultures, such as Japan, it's totally fine to have an agent. Agents are there to help both parties save their face in case there's an argument, which is very uncomfortable for the Japanese culture. And the same goes about legal. In the USA, it's totally fine to come with legal around the table. But in the Middle East, that's probably something you want to avoid because that would not be too productive to help develop this relationship that is so important in the region.
Talking a little bit about the different layers of culture, Claude, in your training courses, you mentioned the different layers of culture. And if I remember correctly, I saw one of your PowerPoint slides that actually had an onion and the different layers that an onion has. So can you tell us about the different layers of culture that you talk about? You know, how many layers are there? And do you have some examples of those different layers that you can share with us?
Of course. So we identified three layers of culture. There's the behaviors, so that's the most superficial aspect of a culture. So typically, this is what most people will be aware of and then can also explain quite easily. And that's also one aspect that was very helped by globalization because people realized that the exchange of business card is important in Japan, maybe not in the US, but they have to pay attention to it in Japan. They also understand that in France or in Germany, you need to address people by their last name. So that's really where globalization helped on this superficial layer of the onion. There's another layer, slightly deeper, and this is related to values, beliefs, and norms. And it's almost become more obvious when we think about the definition of a value, because a value is very, very much a judgment of what is important in social interaction. And as soon as we start talking about judgments and perception, we know that this will differ depending on your cultural background. So again, typically people will be able to more or less explain the difference, but in this case, in the case of values, they will need to be asked by the other party to explain where this is coming from. So that could be, to give you an example, the fact of not mixing professional and personal life in business in France because people might be slightly offended or take it in the wrong way, whereas this is totally acceptable in North America. And the last point, the point that is really critical and that usually creates most of the cultural clashes, it's really around fundamental assumptions. Those points around cultures are deeply ingrained into each of us. This is what we've been told since we were very young. And the best way to give you example around this is to compare the Indian culture to the Japanese culture. In the Indian culture, relating to relationships, if you talk to someone once, you will probably consider that person close to be a friend. But in the Japanese culture, even after speaking to someone 10 times, it will be as if you only barely know that person. And the same would go around arguing. In India, that would add value. It will almost be enjoyable by the different parties. But in Japan, this is really, really uncomfortable. It damages the relationship. So that's points that people take typically longer to understand and they find it harder because it's just a different culture and very different from their way of thinking.
I'd like to talk now about how culture influences the negotiation process. Claude, you mentioned that culture plays a role in three stages. The first stage being strategy, second preparation, and third conducting the negotiations. Could you talk a little bit about how we should embed culture into each of these three stages?
Okay, I'll just give you some brief examples. When we talk about developing the strategy, one point we like to refer in the general techniques of negotiation, but also in the cultural aspect of negotiations, is really the balance of power. What will bring you power in the negotiation? And here, you really need to consider the cultural aspects when you're not negotiating in the same regions where you work. For example, in the US, UK, or Italy, the charisma, the individual will be important as a creation of power during the negotiation. But in China or Indonesia, that will be totally different. What they will value and what they will perceive as a source of power over there is more the group, the internal alignment. This is what for them shows that you have a strong negotiating position. So again, if you need to be cognizant that if you're in the US or the UK, the individual is important, but if you're interacting in cultures such as China or Indonesia, you need to put a lot more focus on the group and internal alignment because this is what will bring you power over during the negotiation. Regarding the preparation, this point, it's important to recognize that there may be some stakeholders that are not around the table in some cultures. And for those stakeholders, you really need to be clear about what are their positions, but also most importantly, what will be their interests. Do they want to just have a contract or do they want to develop a relationship? Do they want a very detailed contract of 500 pages, or do they want something more general? And on the point on general contract, that would be the case in China, where they like to have at the very beginning of the contract three key points expressing the general agreement or the general objectives that should be achieved through the contract so that in the future, if there's a disagreement, they can come back to those 3 points and therefore don't need a very detailed agreement from day one.
And Claude, can you tell us a little bit about the third stage, the conducting of the negotiations?
I would like to say that it's a shift. At that point, there's really a shift. This is where you enter the dynamic phase of the negotiation. And it's especially important when you negotiate in a different culture because people do not always behave the way you expect them to behave. It could be that you're prepared to negotiate with a very traditional person, and when you enter the room, you just realize that they are very modern or more Westerner than you would have expected. So at that point, it's very important to bridge the gap. If they're really open-minded and making an effort, you need to acknowledge it. If they're very traditional, that's where you probably need to adapt even more and almost replicate some of their behavior so that you make them feel comfortable. And really, that's the way to leverage the preparation and also the knowledge that you can acquire during the negotiation process to convince your negotiation partner, but also to create rapport with him, because that's what, at the end of the day, is important in the negotiation.
And Claude, am I right in thinking that a way to think about this is do not be more French than the French? Is that correct?
That's a very good point, Helen, because especially for the French, it could be mistaken and may not help you to develop this rapport that you're looking for.
What advice would you give someone who wants to improve their international negotiation skills?
I think there's really 2 points. The first one is about increasing their understanding. So very much about preparation. Just take a bit of time to learn about this culture. It doesn't have to don't have to know the full history of that culture or exactly how they behave, but just get familiar with that culture. Maybe speak one or two words. Just show the other party that you are trying. And for this, there's a lot of resources on the web or a lot of books. And again, I will refer to Gerd Hofstede, his 5 dimensions. That's a very good way to become quickly familiar with the different cultures that you may interact with. The second aspect is the most important, is to show respect. Really showing respect and showing that you are trying. This is when, even if you make some small mistakes, which will always be the case, as long as the other party perceive that you are trying hard, that you're interested in their culture, and that you have an open mind, and that you respect them, things will be fine. They will just acknowledge, and you probably just joke or laugh about the small mistakes because they understand that you have good intentions and that you're making an effort, and therefore, again, that will help you build rapport.
And Claude, the final question in this podcast. What are the trends that you've noticed relating to cultural differences?
I think the major trend that we've noticed over the past few years is really the emergence of different forces. In the past, cultural differences were really about the region or the country people were from. Now we see more and more that cultural differences may also mean company culture. If you think about some internet companies or some startups across the globe, they will have similar behavior regardless of the country they will be located. They will have very strong company culture, and that will influence the way they behave and also what they expect from other people or other parties they will be interacting with. So that's really a key point that people should recognize more and more and be aware of. Try to not only focus on the country culture, but also think about the company culture of your negotiation partner, because this may in some cases have even more influence on the way they will behave.
That's been a fascinating insight into the role that culture plays in negotiations and how we all need to be aware of the differences in culture as we navigate our way through an increasingly global and connected world. To sum up, it's really about understanding the other person's point of view and where they're coming from, understanding their view of the world. Someone located in North America, for instance, has a completely different view of the world from someone located in Asia. This whole discussion brings two quotations to my mind. The first one is a Native American saying, which goes like this: "Until you walk a mile in another man's moccasins, you can't imagine the smell." I quite like that one. And the second is a quote attributed to the UK playwright George Bernard Shaw, who apparently said that the US and the UK were two nations divided by a common language. Claude, I'm sure your relocation to the US will enable you to appreciate all the more the differences in culture and the importance it plays in business. I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights with us on this podcast.
Thanks, Helen.
This brings us to the end of this podcast on cultural differences in negotiations. I'm Helen Clegg in London, and I'd like to thank Claude Fidelin in New York for being our speaker today. I'd also like to thank our production engineer, Tom Klein, who's based in San Francisco. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Wave of the Future. Join us again soon for the next podcast. If you have any comments on this podcast, please email us. The address is podcasts@atkcarney.com. If you like what you hear, we hope you'll tell your friends. This has been an A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions podcast production. Join us again next time for The Wave of the Future, and remember, sharing knowledge is powerful.